Hold on to your wallets, the Kings of Terror have arrived. This week we have not one but two of the SG-1000's Shitano, the four heavenly kings of the collector's market. You'll recall back in Virtual Boy Works how there were four specific games whose rarity and scarcity sent their prices into the stratosphere. Well, it's arguably the same case for SG-1000, though really the worst offenders here are quarantined in this one episode. If, for some reason, you would like to own a complete set of SG-1000 releases, this week's lineup should help disabuse you of that foolish notion. Not only do Space Slalom and Pachinko regularly fetch four-figure prices, they also suck pretty hard, just like most of Virtual Boy's ultra rares. Sometimes a game is printed in low quantities because it's just not worth having. The first of the SG-1000's super bosses arrives here with Space Slalom. You'll notice I don't have a copy of this game in hand to show the box of, and that's because I don't feel like spending $1,000 just to get a photo of it. Thankfully, Omar Cornut of SMS Power and Lizard Q was kind enough to send along scans of the packaging. Anyway, there's one cool thing about Space Slalom. According to SegaRetro, it was developed by Orca. Orca, as it turns out, would undergo some massive upheavals around the time this game shipped, breaking apart and spinning off into other studios. Before too long, some of Orca's talent would found a studio called Toaplan. You know Toaplan, of course. They created the original arcade version of Tiger Heli, which we've seen on NES Works, in a cart whose underlying premise and quality were strong enough that it still managed to be enjoyable despite being developed and published for NES by the dubious duo of Micronix and Acclaim. And there was that whole Zero Wing thing. So it's neat that Space Slalom has a connection to a legendary arcade shooter developer. And, well, that's actually all that's neat about Space Slalom. You may be thinking, but Jeremy, here is a game about a spaceship created by a primeval variant of Toaplan. How could this not be good? Honestly, I can't explain the whys and wherefores here, but I can definitely confirm Space Slalom is not good. Not that it's especially terrible or anything, but there's just not much to this cartridge. It's not a shooter for one thing, it's a racing game, as the title suggests. Unfortunately, it's not an interesting racing game. We do have one of those this week, but Space Slalom ain't it. Here you control a space shuttle as it scrolls along, slaloming. You have a set amount of time in which to reach the end of the stage, and you need to pass through as many pairs of winking stars, which function here as slalom gates, or flags, as you possibly can en route to the end of the level. At the end of the level, your time is tallied and you're penalized for every set of gates you missed along the way. You can adjust your speed with the caveat that the faster you travel through space, the harder it will be to hit all the gates and avoid being penalized. There are no other racers here, only your space shuttle, the gates, and a series of drifting obstacles in the form of large flashing spheres. The spheres don't damage your shuttle, but they do slow you down and waste precious time. Space Slalom is broken into 4 difficulty levels, each of which has 10 courses. Higher difficulty levels beset you with more glowing spheres and give you less time in which to complete a race, but otherwise the game is totally monotonous, a score chase with no bite. Besides its family connections and frightful price, the most notable thing about Space Slalom is how extremely early 80s its theme is. You're not just controlling a spaceship as you race through the stars, you're specifically controlling a space shuttle. Now, for anyone who grew up after the 1986 Challenger disaster, it can be difficult to explain just how much fascination existed in the late 70s and early 80s for NASA's space shuttle. It really and truly seemed like science fiction made real, a vehicle designed to travel into space and bring humankind one step closer to reaching the stars. That enthusiasm went away pretty quickly after the loss of the Challenger, and decades of the American government hemorrhaging cash from science has guaranteed the US will never lead the way into space again. But for a while at least, America's space shuttle program was the subject of genuine admiration around the world. And I suppose Space Slalom being anchored in the early 80s works on another level too. This feels like an early 80s game, and not in a good way. With its dearth of content and meager visuals, Space Slalom gives the air of being one of those shovelware games whose mediocrity precipitated the Atari crash. I suppose if you wanted to be kind, you could compare Space Slalom to those game programs you would type in from the back of a computer magazine. And, as a freebie in a magazine, it would be fine, but it may not be something you'd want to pay full retail price for, let alone $1,000. Fortunately, the SG-1000's next release acquits itself as a racer far better than Space Slalom did. It's Irem's Zippy Race. Now, this game doesn't work quite as smoothly on SG-1000 as it would on Famicom, but since the Famicom conversion was still a few years away by the time this came out, it's kind of a moot point. While Zippy Race isn't quite as strong as Monaco GP in terms of delivering a pure racing experience, it has a more elaborate structure that places it squarely in the early 80s milieu, in a good way. It's a solid arcade title with concrete goals and a more structured setup than the simple high-score chase of Monaco GP. It also delivers the SG-1000's first example of 3D scrolling, as the camera viewpoint changes perspective in the final stretch of each leg in the race. The downside is that it feels a bit glacial next to Monaco GP, but this is more of an adventure race than a simple race around a track. Zippy Race sticks players on a motorcycle in Los Angeles and challenges them to reach New York City, and to get there before 99 other racers. As this is a cross-country endurance race, fuel is your most precious resource. Once you run out of gas, your journey ends. Fortunately, there are a few stops along the way in major cities, and you can top off your tank there. Actually, you can earn fuel in a few different ways. First, each time you reach a waypoint city, that's Las Vegas, Houston, St. Louis, and Chicago, you're awarded extra gas based on your current race ranking. The better your ranking, the more fuel you receive. You can also top up your tank by passing over fuel icons along the highway. Fuel icons always appear in the same place each time you play, so there's definitely an optimal route for you to memorize and follow. Similarly, the cars you race against always exhibit the exact same offensive tendencies. They veer at you to run you off the road until you can safely dodge them. The rigid course layout and rival AI make Zippy Race a fairly static experience overall, the kind of game you could conceivably master pretty easily if you were to take the time to memorize the placement of everything. But the cross-country theme is interesting at least, and the shift in viewpoints is a respectable trick for the SG-1000 to pull off. It's also worth noting that Sega would release a bike-centric variant of the SH400 controller in 1985, the BH400. That's BH as in bike handle. While produced in tandem with Hang-On 2, the BH400 also worked with existing racers, including, theoretically, Zippy Race. Sadly, Zippy Race doesn't fare quite as well with the racing controllers as Monaco GP, since the handle controllers map the fake gear shift to up and down. Zippy Race, however, uses the controller buttons to accelerate and brake, not up and down. Zippy Race is the third of 5 SG-1000 cartridge releases that Sega converted to the MyCard format once the Sega SG-1000 Mark II launched. So evidently it fared well enough to keep it in circulation, but sadly the reissue doesn't offer a revamped control scheme to make it compatible with the bike handle controller. So even if this isn't one for the ages, you can imagine it probably went over pretty well with players at the time of its release, featuring the smoothest and most impressive forward scrolling yet seen in a console game, a claim it would hold until Nintendo shipped F1 Race the following year. And so we come to the SG-1000's single rarest and most expensive game, Pachinko. As with Virtual Boy's priciest title, this really is insanely rare. Multiple online accounts indicate that Pachinko was immediately recalled by Sega after release, meaning the few surviving copies of it are highly sought after by collectors. This game would be reissued shortly after under the title Pachinko 2, but given those two games' distinct names and catalog numbers, Pachinko has become one of those highly prized rarities that bedevils collectors. As for why it was recalled, that information doesn't seem to exist online in any certain terms. The most common speculation online suggests a bug prevented it from being played correctly. That's certainly possible. This is obviously a Pachinko game, which means gameplay, as such as it is, amounts to holding down the button to launch virtual balls while nudging left and right on the controller D-pad. There's not much substance to the action, but given the importance of ball and pin physics for this genre, some sort of math defect that rendered the behavior of the table inaccurate might be significant enough an issue to make Pachinko genuinely worthless. According to localizer and dating sim Pachinko spin-off expert Tom James, virtual Pachinko games like this do have a reason to exist. The core appeal of Pachinko is not the actual gameplay, since that element is pretty minuscule in any format, but rather the inherent gambling potential of the pastime. Pachinko halls continue to drive tons of business in Japan, and while they can't legally award cash prizes, the government is happy to turn a blind eye to the practice of allowing players to exchange their non-cash winnings for liquid money. As such, Pachinko video games are useful as simulations of their real-world counterparts, giving Pachinko fanatics the opportunity to learn the quirks and behaviors of their preferred tables in the comfort of their own home. I can't confirm that Pachinko is based on an existing machine that was in circulation in 1983, but I would be surprised if it wasn't. After all, Sega had 2 decades of experience in arcade amusements under its collective belt by the time it began producing arcade video games, and that included gambling machines, like slots, and, yes, Pachinko. There's a reason Sega has produced Pachinko video games, and Nintendo hasn't. It's because it ties in to the company's location-based businesses. Pachinko for SG-1000 appears to be the first ever proper Pachinko sim released for a home console. There was a release for Magnavox Odyssey 2 called Pachinko, but it was not exactly a realistic take on its namesake. So if this simulation was glitched, it would basically have no reason to exist, which would explain the recall. Of course, the other explanation could be that Sega just shipped it incomplete, as its follow-up a short time later contained 3 unique Pachinko tables compared to the 1 found here. Who knows? Not even Sega, apparently, since most of their institutional knowledge from this era is no longer present within the company. In any case, this is a Pachinko video game, and like I said, that means the action largely consists of holding down a button to launch balls, then using the joystick to nudge the angle at which the balls enter the playing field. To the game's credit, the balls interact with the pins on the board far more convincingly than the ball physics we saw in Sega Flipper. They feel unpredictable in their movement, yet consistent, which I guess is what you want in a Pachinko sim. The real objective here is for the balls you launch to land in the buckets in the lower portion of the field. Each time a ball bearing hits a target, you earn 10 additional bearings. Is all of this worth 2,000 smackers on eBay? Not at all. But you know, maybe if you were to get good enough at real-world Pachinko from practicing with this sim, you could win enough to pay for the investment. And that's since it's a game that just pays for itself. At the opposite extreme from Pachinko, which involves the most static gameplay experience imaginable, we have Exerion. On a technical level, Exerion might even be more impressive than the behind-the-bike POV scenes in Zippy Race. At the very least, it certainly attempts to do more with the SG-1000 hardware than anything we've seen. I don't think you can call the effort a success exactly, but there is something to be said for ambition. And there's no question that Exerion is a much more tolerable experience than the system's previous arcade Jaleco conversion, Pop Flamer. The original version of Exerion was a latter-day Space Invaders derivative, abandoning the fixed formations of alien invaders in favor of more varied and unpredictable foes. Unlike contemporaries such as Galaga, Exerion allowed players to move their fighter up and down along the vertical axis of the screen. Still, in the end, you're a spaceship shooting upwards at aliens that descend from the top of the screen, so it's not really that far removed from Taito's big hit. What primarily set Exerion apart from its contemporaries was the scrolling horizon raster effect. Jaleco managed to create a primitive but effective sensation of forward motion along a planetary surface by making use of a simple visual trick. Vertical lines in the lower quarter of the screen would grow in height as they moved toward the bottom of the screen. This crudely simulated the impression of the ground scrolling beneath your fighter, a sensation enhanced by a layering gimmick. Rows of overlaid objects would briefly rise up behind the horizon's vanishing point, then switch to the frontmost visual layer and scroll downward. The SG-1000, bless its heart, does its best to recreate this effect within its limited boundaries. It manages to pull it off to a certain degree, but the hardware's staccato scrolling capabilities and low-color, low-resolution visuals kinda make you wish they hadn't bothered. It's an absolute headache of a game, just an eye-searing mess of garish color and distracting visual noise. Your solid white fighter, the single-colored foes, and the tiny white enemy projectiles are all varying degrees of difficult to make out against the choppy, chaotic background. The overall effect of this game is like having someone scream at your eyeballs. This effect is reinforced by the sound design of the game, which is like having someone scream at your ears. On every level, it's just an absolute assault. To the credit of whomever converted this game to SG-1000, they did manage to retain most of the enemy designs and behaviors. And more importantly, they carried over your fighter's sense of inertia. There's a bit of a motion curve when your fighter changes directions here, giving you an impression of mass and motion, rarely seen in 80s arcade shooters. The sluggish cornering synced up with the screen's lateral motion in the arcade version helps further convey the illusion of motion and scrolling, something the SG-1000 attempts to recreate without entirely pulling off. It hurts to say this because clearly a lot of effort went into this adaptation, but Exerion on SG-1000 is a lot more interesting in theory than it is playable in practice. But at least we know where all the moai heads in Japanese shoot-'em-ups come from. And with that, we've reached the end of 1983 for the SG-1000. All told, that it comes to a release library of 21 games, more than twice as many as Nintendo put out for Famicom in the same span of time. SG-1000 has covered a lot of bases, from shooters to sports to shooters to tabletop analogs to shooters to maze games to shooters. There's been a lot of shooting is what I'm saying. And while it's hard to say any of these 1983 releases stand the test of time as well as Famicom's best from '83, namely Donkey Kong, Mario Bros. And Baseball, quite a few of these games remain perfectly enjoyable all these years later. With our next episode, we'll move on to 1984, where the Japanese home market really starts to get competitive.